Bonjour à toutes et à tous et
Good morning and thank you for being here. We can start at last. We are a few minutes late, but we are very happy to have you here with us. We have an hour to talk about a very central issue on two regions that are back at the forefront of the news, the Balkans and Caucasus. And these two regions are facing new challenges, being at the crossroads of major surrounding powers. I will speak in French and will also now switch to English so as to have fluid, smooth exchanges with my colleagues. Benjamin Poutot is a researcher. I'm Benjamin Poutot. I'm a researcher at the Jacques Delors Institute, specializing on the EU and the Balkans and Turkey. And Noemi will talk to us about Turkey. I will now introduce my colleagues for this panel, starting with Leila Alieva.
and East European Studies at the Oxford University School for Global and Area Studies. Thanks for being with us. Jakov Devčić, you're head of the representation of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Serbia and in Montenegro. Also with us, Noémie Rébière, tu es docteur en géopolitique, experte sur les questions énergétiques dans les domaines de la défense et de la sécurité.
Noémie Rébière, doctor in geopolitics and associate researcher at IRIS, the Institute for Research and Strategy. And thank you for being with us.
And with, you are associate professor at the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London, right? Perfect. So, je vais revenir au français et je vous propose donc.
For the next hour or so, I suggest we have three parts in this roundtable. First of all, a first round of discussions focusing on these regions and their context and the challenges facing Western Balkans and Caucasus countries. Those countries are Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and the Balkans being all the countries enclaved by the EU, but candidates to the EU: Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Serbia. They are all facing specific challenges, being at the crossroads between Turkey, Iran. How do they interact in this background? So my colleagues will present their point of view, not forgetting to mention the US, who is a major actor in the region in this context of new balances, new circumstances on the world scene. And we will have a time for questions. Then a second round of discussions focusing on short and medium-term perspectives in the region, and you will have some time for question and answers. We will use Slido. You will be able to use a flash code to ask your questions. Without further ado, I suggest we now launch this roundtable. Our main question is, why are we talking about those regions and why including them in one single panel? What we have to bear in mind, as you heard since yesterday morning, is that those two regions are back at the forefront since the massive invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So this is a major change on our continent. We talked a lot of defense, but what you have to keep in mind is that beyond this defense approach, There is an unexpected issue. On the 20th of February 2022, 4 days after Russian invasion, Ukrainians did something quite unexpected. They became candidates to the EU. And Moldavia and Serbia followed suit, and they've been officially recognized as candidates. And there were difficulties surrounding this, but this was quite unexpected, and the EU started grasping the issue. The EU had not been enlarged for 9 years at that time, 12 years now, and it had faced a number of crises since 2008, with the economic crisis, and up until the COVID crisis, and also the migration crisis. So the EU was focusing on those crises and changed focus, diverging and not paying so much attention to the Balkans. But here we're talking about investing for your own security. This is what Ukrainian candidacy shows. We can consider Ukraine as a protection for Europe. So the EU has rediscovered that investing in geographical enlargement is a question of security. When you talk about Caucasus or the Balkans, or in the EU neighborhood, close neighborhood, then when you've got to ask yourselves about those tensions in the Western Balkans, the conflict between Montenegro and Serbia, will it be solved by itself without the EU to intervene? Not necessarily. So Ukraine is the real game changer. But talking about Ukraine, can you imagine that without EU perspective, will Ukraine find peace? Probably not. So the EU has to grasp this, the EU and its member states, including in that country. France has changed its position since 2022 and since the speech of Bratislava, whereby President Macron in the GlobSec Forum said that enlargement is not a question of if, but a question of how. So when and how will it take place? So this question is back at the forefront. How could the EU better integrate its member states? There is a new geopolitical pressure. And in the Caucasus, there's one state that does not want to join the EU. It's Azerbaijan. How can you maintain our influence and protect our partnerships? Azerbaijan, since the war in Ukraine, plays a new role in the gas supply in the EU. But my colleagues will talk about this better than I could do it. So the EU has to focus on those regions and view them from the point of view of enlargement. Now, talking about power, the EU is the first trade partner of all the countries I mentioned, except for Armenia. So, economically, the EU is indispensable, it's central. All those members are part of the European economic cooperation. President Macron mentioned them in the Copenhagen meeting a few days ago. All of them are members, except for Kosovo. They're all members of the European Council, and 7 of those states are candidates to the EU. Armenia is also in the same process. So when you talk about cooperation, those countries made a very clear choice of sharing a common destiny. So they belong to the European political family, whether they be actual members of the EU or not. These are not peripheral spaces or tampon areas. They are not peripheral. They are states that have already made their choice. Western Balkans, I'm more familiar with. Well, I often hear that Serbia is the great ally of Russia. But if you really focus on Serbia, Serbia does not fulfill European criteria in terms of common security. It's the only Western Balkan state that does not fulfill the criteria. And so they did not want to join NATO. But when you actually consider their military practices, they organize them together with NATO and with the EU more than with any other partner, especially Russia. Serbia does not buy Russian military equipment since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. On the contrary, they buy from France and from the EU, including their military equipment. So let's not be mistaken in thinking that those states are beyond our control. They actually want to be part of the European family. Why am I asking this question? Is there no questioning about their geostrategical positioning? No. We just tend to forget the situation and believe that we are the victims of Russian narrative. But the European, the anchoring of those countries in EU is real, and the EU must not forget that they have this advantage. However, this is a contested position because of Russian or Chinese narratives, and we will get back to this in the panel. It is questioned for two reasons. First of all, the capacity of the EU to integrate those states, because after 20 years, the integration process has not improved, and it's geopolitics that encourages the EU to consider the Balkans application. Some actors don't want the peace projects of the EU reaches its objectives, especially Russia. And as I said previously, Russia does not want stability in Western Balkans or Caucasus and doesn't want peace in Ukraine. So Russia wants to keep those regions under pressure so as to threaten the security of the continent and weakening the EU. This is a clear strategy from Russia. So that was a very long introduction. I will stop there and turn to my colleagues. And starting with Jakob.
You know very much the region, you know Serbia. So my question is, when it comes to this Russian influence, how far does it actually reach in the Western Balkans today, especially since the invasion of Ukraine, and specifically in the Serbian context, which is, I said, the only country in the region which is not aligned 100% on the common foreign and security policy, and which is the only country in the region which has not enforced sanctions against Russia. What's its position, especially given that we see that Aleksandar Vučić, the president of Serbia, goes to Beijing, goes to Moscow, and his ruling party, the SNS, and United Russia have ties in common?
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin, and thank you for, first of all, inviting me from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation from Belgrade here. And I'm really glad as we as a Konrad Adenauer Stiftung can be partnering here at this great conference. I really enjoyed the discussions yesterday and today in the morning so far. So, about your question, I would be very short, as Germans like to be. So we perceive, I think, three things in the Western Balkans when we talk about Russian policy. First of all, we are competing for hearts and minds, and this is the biggest challenge, I would say. Contesting narratives, we also heard this yesterday, and conflicting for influence in relation to the EU. As you already pointed out very correctly, the EU is overall in the region the biggest trade partner, the biggest investor, so the good ones, right? But dependent on your perspective, if the glass or the bottle is half full or half empty, you can also say with a modest influence at the end. If we have a look, you also rightly pointed out all these Western Balkans, 6 countries are on their way to the EU. The whole trip began more or less, put it very, let's say, simple, in 2003 with the Thessaloniki summit, when all the Western Balkans countries got an EU perspective. So from the EU, guys, you can do this package of reforms and then you will become one day a member in the EU. So if you have a look, as I said, dependent on your perspective, what we have achieved so far, all these countries are somewhere in a limbo, maybe somewhere without orientation, somewhere with orientation, with a perspective, but overall you could say they're somewhere in between and searching for some light. And us as Europeans, since until the point when the war started, to be honest, we were hiding, right? Because we already said, yeah, you have a perspective, but you know, it's difficult. Governance structures in the EU, we have to discuss and we have to see, but nothing really in substance happened, I think. And in contrary, Russia, with very, very limited resources in comparison to the EU or to the global, let's say global West, achieving very much. And what I mean by saying achieving very much is they achieved in slowing down the whole process of EU integration. I think if we have a discussion also on the Western Balkans, we have also to keep in mind that this is not just an issue of Western Balkans, but in the same time, we have also an increase of nationalism in Europe, within the European Union. And I think nationalism is a contrary to European integration, to supranationalism, the concept. So I think this is also playing in this game we see since many, many years in the Western Balkans. So they achieve a lot through promoting nationalism, through promoting destabilization, and I think this is also, we have to be clear here today, creating a possible threat to our European security. And this is the most important reason why we have to take care much more on the European agenda for the Western Balkans. Our Foreign Minister Johan Wadefull is today in Belfast at the Foreign Ministers Affairs Summit in Belfast, and he said that we have to accelerate this process and to put much more efforts in it. And now, coming back, I think it's not in the first row always against the EU, what Russia is promoting, but against NATO. And this is, although I'm very careful to make comparison between Ukraine and the Western Balkans, but this is something in common, where Russia is also playing against NATO in the context of Ukraine. They do so in the Western Balkans, and this is a very important point. Using widely Serbia as a hotspot to be more concrete, or to be concrete, using some elements of Serbian political landscape to create this nationalism, destabilization, because if you are influencing Serbia, the biggest country in the Western Balkans, you are also having influence in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because you have about 36% of population which is Serbian. You have influence in Montenegro, with 600,000 inhabitants, but over 30% of Serbs living there. In Kosovo, with the, let's say, unresolved status question or frozen conflict between Serbia and Kosovo. In North Macedonia, where you have a majority of people who are having an Orthodox belief, so through the Orthodox Church. So with very, very limited resources, through soft diplomacy, public diplomacy, they achieve a lot. One last example. One of the highlights, the European Union delegation's campaign last year in Belgrade was a campaign of senior people, of pensioners, where they make a public campaigning that the EU is supporting pensioners in Serbia how to use the internet. And pictures with pensioners so that they don't have the password 1234. People were laughing about these campaigns. At the same time, you look like 20 meters their billboard and 50 meters away is a billboard of Russia Today, with a picture of people having a look through this eyes and saying, have the right look, we help you. So very, very simple messaging and very limited resources on a background of nationalism. They contest us, And once again, it's not always against EU, but in the first row, I would say against NATO. And they are very successful. Coming to my last point, why? Because at the end, and I think I can be frank to say so, because they know what they want, and they want to avoid the Western Balkans to become part of Europe, because if the Western Balkans becomes part of Europe, Europe will be kind of united. The European unity, which was pushed through German unity, we were celebrating just some days ago, was a key milestone in strengthening sovereignty in Europe. But we have to do, let's say, the last homework, and this is for the moment now, I believe, the Western Balkans. And the Russians know this, and we in country, we're 27. We have 27 different interests. We are here in the Mediterranean. Ask people why to enlarge the Western Balkans. They will have other questions in their first mind. So we have to convince, right? And we have to, permanently to work on this to have a common interest. And this is unfortunately the difference between us and the Russians. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jakov, and thank you for mentioning this. I mean, I will come back to it when we go to the second round, but it's actually a very important point that we need to mention here, specifically in the French context. But let me turn first to you, Leila. So what about the Caucasus? How does this power plays play out in the Caucasus? What about the means that Russia especially is using and other actors that may be influential in the region? What kind of instruments do they use? What do they play on? Do they play nationalism of other stuff? And what is the EU communications? Is it not functioning as in Serbia, as Jakov was depicting?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for invitation. Thanks for the very interesting audience and the colleagues here. And of course, I will focus on what you just said. What is important in what you said is about Ukraine as an agency. And I think we should look at the situation in the region within interaction between the strategies chosen by the countries themselves and the regional powers, big powers. For instance, in the early 90s, I've written an article which was called Identity versus Geography, because all three Caucasus states came out due to various peculiarities of 200 years of modernization as peoples with strong European identity. They didn't see any other way but integration to Europe. So they were competing all through the 90s. Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia were competing who would be the first to integrate in Europe. Georgians would say, we don't belong to the region. Armenians would say the same. Peter Sholatur, who was not very, positive about, East and Islam, came to Baku and he said, I am so surprised. Your city proves that you went through industrial capitalism. And that was also what established the basis for the strong Azerbaijanis identities as Europeans. However, by now, 30 years after, you will discover something else. We are all characterized, we meaning the Caucasus countries, are all characterized by what one would call balanced foreign policies, while in the early 90s, they were reshaping Eurasia with a very bold and very smart strategies. Georgia would use its main asset as a strategic location. Azerbaijan would use its oil resources to decrease influence of Russia, and they achieved it. Russia got only 10% in the major contract of the century. BTC, Baku Tbilisi Ceyhan, was an important way to diversify and also decrease the influence of Russia in the region. Probably partly that was thanks to the Yeltsin's government, but Russia continued to use one of the major tools to control the Caucasus under its influence, the meddling in the conflicts. So meddling in the conflicts never stopped, although we had a long period of conserved the conflict, but that affected the rest. That affected democratization, this conserved or frozen conflicts. And unfortunately, EU could not play a counterbalancing role. EU did not come up with a very sort of serious critical policy which would help the countries to resolve the conflicts, which means that the Russian influence through the conflicts continued. I would say that there is not only interaction between the strategies of the local actors, who I strongly consider agencies, and capable of influencing the policies of the regional powers. It's not only interaction of these two factors, but also interaction, of course, between democratization and geopolitical security threats. So geopolitics, for instance, with the Ukrainian war, gave a very serious foundation for the government in Georgia, for instance, to justify their sort of slowing down the reforms and taking the steps towards, suppression of democracy by saying that, if we make a bold choice and we choose to integrate in EU, you will have to follow the path of Ukraine, because they were left alone. And that was a very serious sort of argument in all countries of the Caucasus. Here I would like to stop, and there is a lot to speak about, but probably in the second round. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leila. But anyway, we're staying in the Caucasus because now I'm turning to you, Alexander. Maybe you want to add something on the region, maybe specifically on Georgia, or extend onto specific areas.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thanks for inviting. I'm very, very glad to be here. I think it's very ironic what's happening in the Caucasus, because you had always Georgia, who was extremely anti-Russian. You don't, all right, okay. I should be closer to my mouth, all right, sorry. So you always had Georgia that was, in its foreign policy orientation, extremely anti-Russian, right? Ever since the 90s, since the two wars in Abkhazia and South Ossetia that peaked in 2008 in Russia-Georgia war. And now it's flipping in a different direction. That is, its foreign policy is increasingly accommodating Russian interests. It's anti-democracy, anti-EU. And Armenia, that is quite comparable neighbor of Georgia, right? I mean, Armenia and Georgia, they are similar in many ways, right? Because they are both fragile democracies, small countries. They don't have oil and gas like Azerbaijan. And their foreign policy was always very different from each other, right? Unlike Georgia, Armenia always perceived Russia as its security guarantor because of its war in Nagorno-Karabakh, and that is now changing again because Russia didn't step in to protect Armenia against Azerbaijan. So you have this shifting and changing kind of tectonic shifts in foreign policy of these countries, and it's very painful to observe sometimes because I mean, Georgia, that was the front runner in reforms. It was signing all these association agreements with the European Union. It achieved EU candidate status, and now look at where it is, right? It's on the brink of losing its prospect to become a member of European Union at any point in the future. I think I will stop here and I can follow up more afterwards.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexander. And now we're, je vais revenir en français d'ailleurs parce qu'on va conclure.
I'm going to switch back to French because we're going to conclude this first round in French. We have a major player in these two regions. Aside from Russia, it is Turkey. Turkey uses many means, one of them being its ambition to become an energy hub, to start playing a huge role in the region. Could you talk about that, please? Thank you very much, Benjamin. Thank you for inviting me. When talking about the relationship between this region and this actor, from an energy perspective, we really have to think about energy as being about in territorial integrity, for which Turkey is a major player. Of course, there are so many energy issues. We often talk about the major corridors, and we will delve on them, but it's also about development of liquefied gas, and maybe we'll have time to talk about it more a bit later. That was a huge recent shift in terms of diversification, and there's also a lot of investment in critical infrastructure, including in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe. But let's come back to the initial question, that of great corridors. When we look back at the history, we can see that in the last 25 years, Turkey positioned itself as an energy hub, a major energy hub. Thanks to its geographical position as a bridge between the Caucasus, which is a producing region with Azerbaijan being one of the producers, and to the west, Europe and Southern Europe, that are the consumers of that energy. Three major phases between the 2000s and nowadays. First phase, it's important to understand it because it really defined the region, the fall of the wall in the 90s. Western companies then rushed to the Caspian Sea petrol. First pipelines built at the very beginning of the 2000s. The Baku-Tbilisi-Can, which was mentioned, this is a gas pipeline, a petrol pipeline that will go all the way to Aegean on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey, and that was the first operational pipeline in 2006 allowing to export petrol from Baku to international markets. That pipeline has defined the region of Caucasus and gave Azerbaijan a major role, a key role, that of just like petro-monarchies, they gained experience, increasing experience and influence. After the implementation of that pipeline, a new pipeline will be built, Baku-Tbilisi-Erzurum, which will be tied to the Trans-Siberian pipeline later on. And in competition among the competitors, Russia, simultaneously to the building of these two pipelines, is trying to position itself within the region and is trying to use Turkey as an energy hub as well. So at the same time, Russia built the Blue Stream, which is a pipeline that is crossing the Black Sea from the north in Russia to Asamsun in Turkey, and we can see it displayed on the map here. So that was the first phase of that campaign, the first type of competition which we'll have between Russia and European projects at every phase. Second great phase of pipeline construction in the region, starting in the 2010s. For the EU, the goal is to secure and diversify its energy providers. We're talking more and more within the EU of having strategies to diversify. And that is a position that the EU is going to strengthen increasingly following the annexion of Crimea by Russia in 2014, which has accelerated the construction of pipelines on the Turkish territory to reach the Caucasus, so Azerbaijan through Georgia. That's the second phase of construction. So that's a new project called the Southern European Corridor, which completes the Baku-Tbilisi pipeline to reach the Trans-Anatolian pipeline, because it crosses Anatolia from east to west, and it will link up the Greek-Turkish border to the Turkish-Azerbaijan border, and it will cross Greece and Albania to reach southern Italy. In parallel to the construction of that project that was greatly supported by the EU and by the US, which allows the EU to diversify its energy supply, Russia, in parallel to that, is also offering competing pipelines There was a South Stream pipeline that was cancelled after the increasing tensions between the EU, Ukraine and Russia. And following the annexation of Crimea, there's a lot of measures taken by the EU against Gazprom's monopoly. So to respond to this legislative attack by the EU, Russia offers the Turk Stream, which links up Russia with the north of Turkey at the border between Turkey and Greece. So that was the second major phase of pipeline construction. And in 2022, and maybe we'll stay on that topic. Following the start of the war in Ukraine, there's a new phase of acceleration of a new project, and I will keep that information for the second round of questions, meaning the middle corridor, which will help them free up resources present in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, to bring them back to that European corridor via the Caspian Sea, to bring energy resources via that corridor. Just one last thing, since we're talking about competition here and differences between the major players. Something that's always interesting in geopolitics is to look into the vision of each player and what are their interests. Let's look at the EU, Russia, and Turkey's approaches when it comes to all these various energy projects. For the EU, the major challenge when constructing pipelines and when implementing the Southern Corridor, the main goal is to reduce its energy dependence on Russia. In 2010, Russia represented about 40% of the energy and gas supply of the EU. And the EU sets as a goal reducing its dependence. So we'll get gas from Azerbaijan and Caucasus in the EU so that we reduce our dependence on major players, which are back then Russia, firstly, Norway, and then Algeria and Libya down south. And then we'll go and seek the fourth corridor after that, which will be in Azerbaijan, the goal being to go further and further and to get resources from Central Asia and from Iran as well. We'll talk about it later. It's a country that's sanctioned, so it won't be possible. From Russia's perspective now, the goal when constructing this Turk Stream and Blue Stream is a strategic goal. That's a very important one. The goal is to circumvent Ukraine and diversify its supply routes so they can reach European markets. From Russia's perspective, the Ukraine is a territory that concentrates too much transit and traffic. It represents about 90% of Russian gas transiting through the Ukraine to go to Europe. So Russia wants to diversify its routes, and it was the same thing with the construction of Nord Stream. The idea was to access the EU markets without having to cross the Ukraine. And then from Turkey's perspective, there is a political will starting from the 2000s. It's to become an energy hub, but also a multimodal energy hub that's based on land, on railways, and on other modes of transportation. For Turkey, it's a huge energy consumer. It has tripled since the 2000s. So Turkey is not only a transit country, but also a major consumer in the region. Its strategy will be to diversify its supply as well. Initially, Turkey depended greatly on the Russians, so they were really trying to get resources from the Caspian Sea, from Central Asia, and they also decided that they needed to diversify routes, but also means to get that those energy sources, and so they will start building natural gas terminals, and I can talk about it a bit more later. Thank you. Thank you, Noemi.
Yeah. One point what I would like to make when we talk about the Western Balkans and also Russia, but also other actors or players like China, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, for example, what all these powers influencing in the region have in common in comparison to us plus minus, they don't care how they spend money. And they don't care like how much money they spend, right? For strategic interests. They have a totally different approach in comparison to us, Europeans. As we Europeans perceive this policy, first of all, it has to be bureaucratically correctly spent. So the process has to be respected and not the interests, right? So the Russian president, the Chinese president, the Turkish president, they can call their big infrastructure building companies, energy companies, and say, we will invest in Serbia, in Bosnia, and they say, okay, you are the boss, you do it. The German chancellor, or the president of the European Commission, she cannot call a German company and say, you will invest tomorrow in Serbia, because the next day it will be in media and she or he will have a big problem, right? Because you're influencing too much. So this is a big difference. For example, Turkey, in Montenegro, a very small country, 500,000 people. They recently, last year, or 2 years ago, they opened a culture center, and they, for more than half a year, they had language courses for free. So they invited all the population come and learn Turkish, right? In comparison to the German Goethe Institute, is not present in Montenegro, and they're just present in Belgrade and decreasing because of budget restraints, because we have different conditions and different situations at our, let's say, national budgets, right? China, in Serbia, this is the biggest steel production. It's still from the time of Yugoslavia. They employ over 15,000 people nearby Belgrade, right? So after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, this company was in a mess. They didn't produce steel. They didn't earn money, so it was not profitable. What did they do? The Serbian government was more than 15 years ago. They attracted US steel. So US steel came there, was there for, I think, 3 or 4 years, and they said, no, guys, it's not profitable anymore. We cannot do anything. What did they do? They asked the Chinese. The Chinese, they don't care how much it costs. They come, invest, but they create strategic dependencies. The same for infrastructure, when we have a look in the whole Western Balkans. Montenegro had just like a public tender in Montenegro for highway. In Montenegro, they have just 40 kilometers of highway so far. So they try to invest because they depend on tourism. They want to attract tourists, also from France. They have to build highways. So they had the public tender, and out of 10 companies, there were 8 from China. 1 from India, and 1, I think, from Pakistan, something else. I don't know. So why? Because also our European companies, it's not interesting for them, or they are too busy of creating infrastructure at home in European Union. So this is also part of the truth, that we have different preconditions for competition if we talk about geopolitics.
Thank you very much for this intervention. I mean, I a lot of points, and I will also kind of make some points and come back to what you were saying, Noemi, before, just briefly to reflect on some of the things that you've said. But I mean, it's very interesting what you say, because indeed, like, we didn't have this. I mean, we are liberal democracies that enjoy the free will of the market to invest or not. But there is a question also which is very interesting. It is the fact that out of this question, we also lack private investment in the Western Balkans, which is not, I'm talking about the Western Balkans. You will allow me not to talk about the Caucasus, because if you want to add something about it, please do it, but I have no clue about the private investment here. But we lack also a promotion of investments there, and also of the why am I speaking in English? Okay, I will go on in English. And also in investment there, and the image also, I think, is something that was struck, and I think it was said by the previous U.S. administration, saying that a lot of companies don't want to invest because of the fear of corruption, of the fact that the economy is not free enough to make sure that these investments are protected, is still something that countries that, of course, enjoy this free will of the private investment have to struggle with. So I agree with it. Just to come back to the, so you mentioned the Smederevo factory, actually, the one that was saved by the Chinese. This is also, I think, something that should be mentioned, is that the Serbian government is playing with this, as they do with the Russian. They're displaying a positive image of Russia, of China, saying, oh, they saved the jobs. They don't say that the European Union, which is the first investor actually in Serbia, they don't say the European Union saved this and that jobs. They don't give numbers. But it's very, as you say, the Smederevo factory was so symbolical in the Yugoslav history, in the Yugoslav time, that for the people it was symbolic to save this. But they don't see the EU promoted as much. And it's because also this kind of narrative, when we talk about foreign powers that try to play a role in the Western Balkans, in the Caucasus, what we have to see is when it comes specifically to Serbia. And again, I would dislike with this map, and when I was saying that I don't see Serbia as an ally of Russia, but still, they have a government which definitely plays with the Russian narrative because it allows them to stay in power easier, because it allows them to put pressure on the EU saying, oh, careful, President von der Leyen or President Macron or Chancellor Merz, we have other options if you want to. And maybe they don't have other options, because what is Russia offering as a political or economic option to Serbia? Nothing. What is China offering? Nothing, except loans, actually. Most of the times, China is not investing. It's giving money to these countries. You mentioned the Montenegrin highway. China said, okay, we can build the highway, but you have to what's the word? You have we're going to lend you 1 billion euros so we can build the highway. So they have, like, as we say in French, the butter and the money of the butter, the Chinese. So this is also something that is not displayed by local governments, but they want to portray it as national victories. So Serbia is using this Chinese money to say, oh, this is our victory. We're protecting the Serbian people. So this is also interesting to see. And finally, and we'll give you the floor again on this, what I think is interesting to put in light, and I didn't really think to mention it before in the panel, but you made me think about this, Noemi, is the way that Balkan countries, and of course, Caucasus countries, sorry, and of course, I mean Azerbaijan, is also trying to be a power in the Western Balkans, because they want to protect their investment there. They want to protect their gas, their energy flowing to the Western Balkans. And we see that Ilham Aliyev, so the president of Azerbaijan, did his first trip ever to Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2023. Same year, he visited Serbia, and they signed memorandum of understanding with Bosnia and Herzegovina, with Serbia, saying that they would like cooperate when it comes to energy, defense. And it's very interesting to see that there is this move and going, because Azerbaijan wants also to be like wants a Russian style rise in the Western Balkans, if I may say so, just betting on energy to build better ties and take profit of this. And also knowing that the corridors that you mentioned, the TAP, that just a lot of acronyms that could be very French. the TAP, the corridor which is going from Turkey to Bari in Italy, is actually going to be connected, and stop me if I'm wrong, but is supposed to be connected to Bosnia and Herzegovina and passing through Albania, Montenegro, which is also very profitable for Azerbaijan.
Juste, effectivement, il y a le...
Just to come back to Azerbaijan, it has an investment strategy, and we've seen it since the very start of the 2010s. Azerbaijan, when the TANAP project was started, they had to choose between several projects that were competing, the Nabucco West and the TANAP. Azerbaijan started then investing in all countries and all critical infrastructure of this corridor along the entire route from the production site, which is normal, but also they started investing in Turkey. They are one of the main investors in Turkey, not just on gas, but on the massive refinery structures as well in southeastern Europe and in the Balkans as well. Azerbaijan is massively investing not just in gas infrastructure, but also in electrical power plants, for example. So there's a real strategy from Azerbaijan. When it comes to the interplays, we would need a much more precise map, but there's a huge thing supported by the EU, what we call the common interest projects, to try and supply in Azeri gas all the southeastern European countries. So it's about connecting all these states. and there's a competition in the gas field that complexifies this. The Turk Stream that reaches the Turkey-Greek border brings Russian gas and is supplying Europe, including southeastern Europe, with Russian gas. There's a sort of a laundering of this Russian gas, but maybe I'll come back to it later.
Perspectives or trends to follow in the region. Do you want to add something on this topic, Alexander or Leila? Or if you want to go ahead directly with one key trend or perspective that you would like give the audience to say, please feel free. Whatever you want, either reacting or doing on this. Yes, so please go on.
So reacting is connectivity is a hot issue now. And it's important in the context of the resolution of the conflicts. You know very well that Armenia and Azerbaijan are now approaching to an important stage of, peace sort of resolution of one of the major conflicts, which was dividing the Caucasus, and also gave Russia a major tool to control it. So the fact that both countries decided to stay away from mediators is the key, because that's what it is. It's growing and maturing these countries as independent actors of international relations, which made them come to the idea that, enough is enough. We need to establish normal relationship in order to make a breakthrough both in the political and economic development. So now, and Trump came up as in time, just to resolve the possible tension and disagreement between how this sort of stretch, 40-something kilometers between the Nakhchivan, which is exclave of Azerbaijan, how it will be operating. Azerbaijan was insisting on sort of non-controlled by Armenia sort of passage of the, cargo through this corridor. Armenia was resisting, and suddenly Trump comes up and says that will be a private American company, by the way. And that, amazingly, but it sort of pacified the situation. So Trump, although he joined the ongoing train, but he brought in some very pragmatic idea, which was taken. So connectivity is something which should look as an opportunity, and from the rather optimistic point of view. There are many opportunities which are opening now for the countries to take advantage of. And I would say some potential of the countries, again, as agencies in the region of the Caucasus, were not taken seriously. For instance, Guam, Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova was an amazing security regional organization, which was created from below, not by Russia, not by other actors, not by China or something. It was the creation of the regional organization. If EU at that time took it seriously and invested in that, I mean, believe me, Ukraine would not have to go through whatever it's having now. If that organization, regional organization, turned into a military defense sort of organization, then I think Russia would not dare to start fighting on the four fronts. However, now Ukraine is exposed, because there are problems with NATO involvement, membership of NATO and things like that, but regional organization could have been, well, at least the idea of that could have been one of the ways out. My major conclusion now, or major take-off, I wouldn't, there are now, I heard in EU also that, we can't transform your societies, we can't do much in regards, we can't influence your societies, it's culture issue. I would say that's very interesting, that the culture is used now by the ultra-right and autocrats of our region. So these kind of coincidence of interests of the autocratic powers about different cultures, about mentalities. So it's a very suspicious thing. So, for instance, there was underestimation of the structural factors influencing the sort of slow democratization or authoritarianization in Azerbaijan, like structural influence of oil resources, combination of the Soviet legacies and oil resources. I should stop.
You still have 1 minute if you want to conclude. Or, okay. Thank you very much. I didn't want to stress you out. But
I wanted to say just
yes,
about
please.
modernization. I mentioned 3 processes which are interacting at the level of the regional geopolitics, democratization, and modernization. For instance, breakthrough in Armenia is part of the modernization of thinking, of minds, because you are adjusting to the changing nature of power. Power is much less about size of the country and much more about the quality, human resources, intellectual resources, IT, and other things. We had a field study once, and it showed how important it is, this movement in the minds, particularly younger generation, this transformation of understanding of power. So this gives a bit of a positive sort of outlook for what to expect in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, Leila. Alexander, you wanted to add something?
Yes.
Maybe at the same time, your key takeaway.
No, connectivity is a very important issue, and it was always a transit region, right, because of its strategic location. So east-west routes, north-south routes are running through the Caucasus, right? The colleague outlined all these energy projects that have been in creation for a long time now, but connectivity also has a dark side, right, because of the sanctions evasion, and that has emerged as a very important factor because, I mean, what sanctions did, it just redirected trade away from Russia by its neighbors, and some of these neighbors happen to be in the Caucasus, right? I mean, most of it is going by Armenia, because Armenia is part of Eurasian Economic Union, but Georgia is also a very important actor, right? And what it does, it creates all these informal and illegal trade links with Russia. Not necessarily illegal, because these countries didn't join the sanctions. It's normal trade for them, right? But it is on the brink of legality and illegality, because, I mean, Georgia now emerged as an oil exporter country. I mean, it doesn't have any oil. How can it export oil? But what it does, it brings oil from Russia, and then it sends onwards to Europe and to other places. Georgia also is exporter of the cedar wood. Georgia doesn't have any cedar wood. I mean, of course it's coming from Russia. Armenia, I mean, these countries, they kind of capitalize on their previous niches in trade, in what kind of role they play in sanctions busting, right? Armenia had a long tradition of trade in jewelry and gold, and trade networks involved in this, and because of that now it plays an important role of taking Russian gold and precious metals, rebranding into Armenian and sending to places like Emirates, right? So, and again, a lot of this is on the paper, but it is on the brink of legal and illegal, and that's more kind of pessimistic side of connectivity in the Caucasus.
Noémie, tu veux revenir sur une touche plus optimiste ou plus pessimiste?
Noémie, do you have a more optimistic or pessimistic note? Well, I'd like to echo what was just said on the fact that Caucasus becomes an export and import and export platform in this context of sanctions. Starting 2022, I mentioned the 3 great phases of pipeline construction, and the 3rd phase is just that one post-Ukraine war. War in Ukraine has triggered a change in trade flows between EU and Russia. So there's a new dynamic that reinforces the position of Turkey and Azerbaijan and Georgia, which become pivotal. On the one hand, they export Russian oil and gas that is under sanction and cannot be directly supplied into Europe. So they launder, so to speak, Russian oil and gas. Azerbaijan and Georgia are ex-Soviet countries, and they have a network of oil and gas pipes, and that network is very dense. It's called the Northern Corridor, and it connects together Central Asia countries, Kazakhstan, and so on. These countries want to open up, and they use those corridors, South and North Corridor. But in the case of sanctions, oil and gas keeps transiting there, and Azerbaijan, since the beginning of Ukraine war, has increased its gas exports by 46% towards the EU, but they don't have such production capacities. So it's quite astonishing that they may have increased their capacity to that extent. So that means that they imported gas through those networks, and this gas is oriented towards the EU. This is a direct consequence of sanctions. These countries are not outlaws because they have not signed the sanctions, so they are outside the scheme. And Turkey is becoming a platform. They allow Russia to keep exporting. But what is less known is the import side into Russia. There are EU exports towards Russia. For instance, for dual-use goods, civil goods that may be used militarily. It can be small ships or high technology, and Russia needs such items. Since the beginning of war in Ukraine and the increase of sanctions, we have witnessed some types of export increasing 200 or 300% towards Azerbaijan, Armenia. They import from Germany or other states, and those imports have risen hugely. So there's that corridor that enables EU countries to export into Russia.
Yeah, I think I can add the washing machines. The exports from the EU to for example, to Kazakhstan also increased, I think, over 150% of washing machines, and you have a huge hills of new, not used washing machines in Kazakhstan. There were also media texts in Germany on this, where journalists found out those hills, and now they try to get in talks, etc., etc. That's just an addition to this. So to be realistically but pessimistic, but also optimistic. Pessimistic is if we do not achieve tangible results in the next few years in the Western Balkans, we will face a huge security-relevant backlash. I think this is clear because the other side is working very hard on it. And I'm really concerned that we will have to do now these steps forward in the enlargement policy in this world of unrest. If we have a look on the world of nowadays, we cannot afford ourselves anymore to have this region in a kind of vacuum or limbo stance. So because of geopolitical reasons, because I also believe that the whole region can contribute to our sovereignty of Europe in the global or in the world of unrest, talking about rare earths, right? For example, when talking about Serbia and lithium, but not just Serbia, you have also in Bosnia and Herzegovina lithium, etc., etc. Talking about energy, talking about very high qualified work stuff when we talk about IT industry in the Western Balkans. And I think also that the Western Balkans can and will contribute to security when we talk about migration. I know migration in France is a very hot topic and very important topic, and wars and natural catastrophes will happen all around the world. It will happen in Africa, and those people will come through the Mediterranean Sea, but also through the Western Balkans. And in this regard, the Western Balkans are of key importance, I think. So therefore, we have to put much more efforts in the next years to avoid more instability in our interest. And this is my positive point, that we have it in our hands, right? We have just to show political courage and will to make a step forward. Now, in the last years, I mean, we're talking about Zeitenwende in Germany, so something what fundamentally changed with a war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. But if you ever look in the newspaper, I think it's not enough what we have achieved so far. And this is also something which is, I think, important in regard of the Western Balkans. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Jacob. Et en réalité, je suis ravi que tu...
Thank you very much, Jacob. And I'm very happy that you mentioned this, because it connects directly to what I said. So what you're saying is that let's not be pessimistic. There is one challenge, that of our public opinions. Of course, what's at stake is this enlargement, and it's necessary for our security in terms of energy or defense. But if this enlargement is necessary, many people, including in this room, ignore this debate. This debate just does not exist in France. So this campaign is not to be led on the ground, on the field, but it's to be led here in our minds. And if we don't do it, some others will do. Russia is attacking France through propaganda, misinformation. So Russia will make sure this enlargement is not implemented. Now, our politicians have that role to play, so as to avoid putting peace in danger. And in France, what is specific is the referendum. And if the countries that we consider closest to EU adhesion, Montenegro and Serbia, if they reach the finish line, I'm not sure that European citizens will be informed and ready to vote for enlargement. I hear that we have reached the end of this conference. Person will take a couple of questions. We are going to put the slider on the screen. If anyone wants to ask a question here in the room, we will give you the floor. Thank you. You mentioned French public opinion. I'd like to mention local public opinion. And perhaps local public opinion should be convinced of the interest of exceeding the EU when you have governments on place that does not meet EU criteria. I have in mind Serbia more specifically.
It was very much directed to Serbia, but I can also answer if you want to.
Of course, I think you are totally right. We, as a foundation, and of course as Germany, we would like to have Serbia on some other place, right? As a place within the European Union. But before my time now in Belgrade, I was working in the German Bundestag, and I had the possibility also to regularly meet the Chancellor Merkel, and she always was saying, we cannot bake our counterparts. It's a very bad translation now, I know, but we cannot, let's say, imagine or let's say create the other side, right? We have to deal with those people who are elected. So that means step by step pushing, not because we love them, but because it's in our interest. So this is, let's say, my hope, and I totally agree what you have said.
Et si je peux juste compléter.
And if I may complement what you just said, Jacob, I still believe that there is a genuine responsibility on the part of European leaders in the face of the silence of President Macron on this, or President von der Leyen, for Georgia, the situation is different, but I think that EU reaction is comparable, and we see a disconnection between the situation in those countries and the EU, with a democratic backlash. I think our leaders should and can say to Serbia that their behavior is unacceptable, especially when they don't align with sanctions and when they act in a way that the state cannot act free. I will take another question on Slido.
Maybe for you, Leila or Alexander. Trip kind of modifies the balance in the South Caucasus. Change the balance. Let's say, what is bouleverse in English? I have. It overwhelms. To which extent the trip overwhelms the balance in the South Caucasus?
Basically violates or
just changes the balance. Just your.
We tend to look at this connectivity as a means of normalization and peaceful sort of tool. So balance, Russia stayed away for a while, I think, at least while it's involved in the destructive foreign policy. Russia will not be part of it, although Azerbaijan is sort of preparing to be a hub for the north-south connection as well. But I don't think it will be possible with TRIP, with the involvement of America, to do anything in this regard, especially with the sanctions against Iran. So that might be on hold. But if you speak about the long-term future, that might just actually bring the positive, I think, the balance of power in terms of, Turkey, the America, Turkey, the sort of connection between China and the Europe. I think we'll come to a greater multilateral sort of multilateral order, which might be, which this part might actually can contribute quite significantly. But unfortunately, at the moment, some of the actors which potentially could benefit from that, they're in like rogue states, and they can't be part of it at the moment. So,
I agree with Leila completely. But just 2 points. I think Iran is not necessarily happy with Trump corridor running on its northern border, right? I mean, in general, as Leila said, I think it will generate extra economic activity in the region. It will benefit all the actors, but potentially I see how Georgia may lose out economically, because I mean, so far Georgia has a monopoly of a supply of goods to Armenia because of its access to Black Sea ports, right? Armenia has been always complaining about extortionist monopoly of Georgia over these routes, and potentially, I mean, you cannot change the direction of the pipelines that is already there, or railways that is already there, but there's going to be certain amount of trade that will be diverted away from Georgia focused corridor to TRIP, if TRIP happens at some point.
Pour compléter, effectivement, je rejoins.
Just to add to this, I fully subscribe to what was just said. It will allow Armenia to free itself, because as we've seen these different phases of pipeline construction, so initially in the 2000s, then 2010s, what happened is that Armenia ended up being very isolated within the southern Caucasus. It was completely circumvented by the entire series of corridors that are oftentimes multimodal. We were talking about petrol and gas, but there was also a railway corridor created between Baku and Tbilisi and Kars in Turkey. So there's an entire series of transportation of goods and energy and people outside of the purely energy dimension that ended up isolating Turkey. So maybe it will allow itself to reintegrate itself within the region and leave its dependence on Russia. The entire Armenian energy sector was bought up, 100% of it, by the Russians. So there's a huge dependence on Russia for Armenia, and Armenia really needs to open itself up and get rid of this dependence on Russia. Last thing, with the middle corridor that I mentioned earlier, that will connect with the Caucasus with China and with Europe while crossing Central Asia. This middle corridor is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, so there's huge Chinese investments as well as European investments, much lesser than the Chinese investments, of course, but important investments. Trump is probably trying to get back into that game of corridor construction that are being built at the heart of the Asian continent. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a last question. Alexander, you mentioned this issue before. It's talking about some of the tensions between some powers. So internal tensions, like in Iran, wouldn't that have a negative impact on their power and credibility? So the tensions internally for certain powers like Iran, do they not question their power and credibility? Iran right now is not playing a key role in Western Balkans. The time when Iran would support the Bosnians during the Yugoslavian war, that is behind us, and Iranians have been completely set aside. Maybe the only exception is that of cyber attacks from Iran against Albania, attacks waged by Iran because Albanians host opponents to the Iranian regime. But I think that's not a game changer. And aside from trying to get the support of its allies, I think Albania is not suffering too much from it. And I don't think Albania is a priority for Iran in its foreign policy either. Would you like to answer this question? On the geographical context, maybe.
That no, it doesn't, or yes, it does, so they don't play a role. Whatever is the answer from, yeah.
The survival of these states depends on their capacity to deal with the most complicated neighbors. So they try to deal with Russia, they try to deal with Iran through the very sophisticated ways of diplomacy. So of course they understand what is what, who is Russia and who is Iran. Azerbaijan has very sort of, how to say it, complex relationship with Iran, but it manages to keep the peaceful relationship. That's very important. It's a very complex geopolitical environment for these three states. So it requires, you can understand, for instance, when Pashinyan, when he just came to power, stated, you know, Karabakh is Armenia, and then he stated something else, totally opposite. Then he does, but you can see why is he doing that? Because he is squeezed between power centers, which, you know, requires him to do such things. You need really a skill to, or Azerbaijan is making enormous challenge to Russian policy by leaving them with 10% of, or giving aid, huge aid to Ukraine, supporting a territorial integrity, but at the same time saying Putin that, you know, we respect you and we have sort of, so it's a very complex game of diplomacy. And, you know, it's not always successful. For instance, now there was a quite aggravation of relationship between Azerbaijan and Russia. Yeah, but Iran is deterred in the open confrontation with Azerbaijan because of 20 or 30 million of Azerbaijanis living in Iran. So they have to balance.
So, any other reaction? If not, je vous propose de...
If that isn't the case, I suggest we wrap up this session. This was the last word. Thank you very much to all 4 speakers. Thank you to the audience as well. Thank you to everyone, and let's go and have lunch.